guess at this point we just move on to your trash takes, right?
Yep.
I think so.
Well, there we go. Well, Ningen, you can go ahead and bring it up, and I guess I'll go ahead and read it out for y'all.
No mistakes this time, right? Don't read three different ones.
Here we
No,
go.
no, this one I picked this week, so
Yeah,
all right.
handpicked it.
For this week's trash take, we have, of course, a submission by IHTS Carter. Thank you very much for your submission. We definitely appreciate again you guys answering. Next episode, we might try something a little different, so stay tuned for that. But
Ooh.
from here, the trash take specifically is the Bulma fight is not a gimmick fight. The mechanics she has already existed. She's just intense. She's just if the intensifying battles in Ultimate Clash made out and made her. So they're essentially saying the mechanics that Bulma has already have existed in game, and they're just a extreme version of them as like a hard difficulty version of those existing contents that is usually like for like let's say early or mid tier players, right, who are like new or like semi new to the game
Hmm.
compared to end game players. So I know I picked this one because I actually do know that Ningen and I don't necessarily agree on
Yeah,
this, and
that's
it would be
right.
an interesting discussion. So
I'll
Boo.
let you guys give
I'll
your
let
arguments, I guess, and I'll. Do you want me to dictate the end result here? I
I'll
get to
let
be biased.
yeah, we could do that. I'll let Ningen
All
go
right.
first.
All right, so I think that this is a massive, gigantic, humongous, universal L take because the Bulma fight is the absolute definition of a gimmick fight. Just because it has things that have been used in other fights before. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't know. I don't get why that makes any difference because I could just say that those were gimmick fights as well. I don't know if we want to specify which ones they were, but the Bulma
Right.
fight specifically is a gimmick fight because of the way it's built. With like I think the first two phases specifically, and I know this is something that we have talked about, I believe, in the past when we were talking about like different ways that you would evaluate what you would call like the best team in the game or something like that, right? But the example that I think of is, so let's say Buhan has just come out, right? So I can put together a build for Buhan's team that can absolutely destroy Gogeta, Janemba, Goku and Frieza, Beast Gohan, Blue Gogeta. I know those are older fights. Cell Max, and then I go into the Bulma fight and I just keep losing in phase 1 and 2 because I don't pick up enough rainbow orbs or I don't do enough additional supers. I don't
Hmm.
understand how that is not the absolute definition of a gimmick fight because you have to build your team around the gimmicks of the event. Otherwise, you can't even get through to the last phase, right? Whereas, like, even in tougher fights, like let's say Goku and Frieza as an example, we all know, like, I did a reaction to the run and everything, like, Truth beat Goku and Frieza with the Heroes team. Like you can use some of these like meme teams against certain runs because you can get away with like clutch dodges and all that kind of stuff. Whereas for this event specifically, like if you don't bring a rainbow orb changer on your team, it's just complete RNG whether you actually get past the first phase or not. And even if you bring a rainbow orb changer, if they're in slot 7 or even on turn 2 and you get unlucky, then you just don't win, regardless of like what team you're using, what the abilities of the other characters do. Yeah, I just don't like. I mean, I guess maybe people will have different definitions of what a gimmick fight
Hmm.
is, but like I don't understand if gimmick fights are a thing that we're going to classify some fights as, then I don't see how this fight like isn't one of them. So
Hmm.
because yeah, like I said, you can take teams that are super good and work really well in other like or every other fight in the game without even having to change the team builds at all, and then they won't be able to beat this fight, not because the team like doesn't do enough damage or you just get killed. It's because you can't do the gimmicks of the fight, right? So yeah, I don't know. I don't get it personally. So come on, Minato, let me know. Why is it
So
not a gimmick fight?
I completely disagree with the points that you made because
Oh.
of the fact that you're saying that you have to build your team around the Bulma fight, but you have to do the same thing for Goku Frieza. You have to do the same thing for Gogeta and Janemba. And the reason for that is because unit designs at this point have gone so complex that not every team build and not every character, unless you're just like the definitive best team in the game, like in Broly team even potentially. And even then, it's like there's units you sub out in certain fights. You brought up the Goku Frieza fight, and you brought up, oh, you can get clutch dodge, but you can't dodge in the 17 and Frieza phase. You can't bring dodge characters in there unless you have
Hmm.
dodge disable character, or maybe someone potentially also has guard like into Gohan. You can kind of get away from it in there. But then another example I brought up earlier this podcast, I brought in Gohan for that reason, and then he got locked in slot 7. No, he got locked. Yeah, he was in slot 7. He got locked turn 1 by 17, and then
Hmm.
17 instantly killed him. That is just me instantly losing because of how my rotations are, because the 17 fight locks. What's the difference in that and then you losing because your Rainbow Orb Changer was in slot 7 with the Bulma fight? I personally don't see the difference because that is the boss's ability causing you to lose,
Hmm.
not the unit in itself. Another thing is I don't see where you don't ever build your team in a way that doesn't try to counteract the boss. You're not going to bring stacking characters in the Gogeta fight. You're going to bring a character even like Intafapu or Super Saiyan 3 Goku who can instantly handle what the boss is doing. But then, let's say Fatbu, for example, or Super Saiyan 3 Goku, in Goku and Frieza, they could have trouble in that fight because Ibu doesn't do enough damage, or Super Saiyan 3 Goku tapers off later on. The thing of saying that Bulma's mechanic specifically makes her a gimmick fight when other bosses also have very powerful mechanics that keep you from playing even sometimes or using certain characters in general, it's the same thing at the end of the day. These mechanics are keeping you from using certain characters. That's just how all bosses are designed. So I don't see where you can call Bulma a gimmick fight, but then not Goku and Frieza, or even Gogeta nullify certain super attacks. You have to bring a domain ability for him to actually get rid of that. Janemba makes it difficult to bring a lot of STR characters, like let's say even Roshi, right? Roshi, you could bring his team, but then you have Vidal and then Roshi, and then Janemba gets the huge attack buff and then ends up killing them just because of their typing. Not every character is going to be good in every fight, but I don't know. It just feels weird to specifically quote Boma out for it just because maybe she has the most annoying version of these gimmicks, right?
I think,
But at the end of the day, all these bosses have very tough gimmicks that hinder your characters and what characters you bring.
yeah, I think the difference is just what you would, I guess it comes down to what you would consider like is a gimmick more so than, I guess you could be right in the sense that some mechanics people will be a bit more favorable to than
Hmm.
saying they are like straight out gimmicks, right? Because obviously I hate rotation locking. Because yeah, that is a thing that you could be doing super well in the event, and then if you want to be using no items, because obviously you can get rid of rotation locking with certain items, but like you can get to a certain turn and then it's just like, well, you just lose now because the wrong unit got locked in slot 1, so you just die.
Or I do want to point out, like in 17 and Frieza in that phase, I'm bringing AGOUI Goku, Raps Universe 7. One of my characters end up doing an additional super attack or more damage than I kind of wanted them to do. Then I
Hmm.
load it into that phase that cancels dodge, and my AGOUI, he's just dead because of the boss, and I couldn't get the domain out. Right? That is not the fault of the unit, but the fault of the event, and I instantly lose because of how the event is designed.
Yeah,
I don't.
I think the reason why the Bulma one gets singled out more, and someone else mentioned this in the chat. Shout out to Jaren, but
Mhm.
it's the fact that it's the multiple different mechanics in the same fight, because there are some teams where like if you, I mean, obviously not every team can beat every event, and I do agree, like you said, you're not always going to just be running the same 6 units against every fight, but
Hmm.
some of them, they just don't feel like they balance off against each other super well, because like some teams, for example, if you are going to bring rainbow orb changers, the only rainbow orb changers on that team are characters that like don't do any additionals or potentially aren't very good defensively, so then your team will struggle in phase 2 or phase 4 against the final Bulma because you had to build part of the team to get through phase 1. So then you can bring characters that will do guaranteed additionals or something or give extra key, because that's the other thing about phase 2, which is super annoying. It's like you have to do 4 supers, but you also get -9 key. So then you bring characters that can do a bunch of additionals, but then none of those characters are rainbow orb changers or are particularly good defensively for phase 4. But then you also have to have characters on your team that are good defensively, so that when you get through the first 2 phases, you can then still do the phase at the end. And I think it's the combination of the mechanics, I think, that make it feel like such an annoying, like, gimmicky fight. Because it's not even necessarily, I wouldn't say calling it a gimmick fight as well, just to be clear as well. I don't necessarily mean that as to say like that's a bad thing. I'm not saying like it's a gimmick fight and therefore it's bad. That's just the way I would describe it, because you really do have to build the team in a very certain way to get it done. Whereas I think other events, you do have to still consider the boss mechanics, but like things like locking, I mean, there's not really much you can do about that other than to bring a team that is largely strong defensively. But those characters are then not going to necessarily have these other abilities like rainbow orb changing and additional supers and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
So,
I just think that that exact argument applies to Goku Frieza. Because, okay, let's say you bring really strong defensive characters. Not a lot of characters are going to be strong defensively, but also because they straight up tank supers. Many of the strongest defensive characters are because they just straight up dodge, you know? But then you can't, unless you have a unit like Tech UI, and Tech UI is the only character that could disable dodge, like disable the dodge, disable mechanic, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's the only character that can do that. So if you don't have him, it's like, okay, I need a strong slot 1 character that also isn't a dodge character, that also doesn't taper off during the fight or needs to build up. And then you could do all that for Goku Frieza, and then it's like the same thing where you have to ha- recognize and think about multiple mechanics in that fight. Maybe not as much as Goku and Frieza, but then with Goku and Frieza, you have to consider, oh, the type of this boss, what restrictions, and that's why I'm saying units are so complex nowadays that
Mm-hmm.
that argument could be applied to any of these bosses, because all these bosses at this point also have multiple mechanics. It's not, if when it was just like, let's say if we go back in time and it was just maybe Goku and Frieza and Bulma, but then
Mm-hmm.
now we have these 2 fights, and I'm sure the 10th anniversary is also going to have fights that will have minus key, locking, evasion, disable. And then it's either a thing of, I would argue that I don't mind it being called a gimmick fight. I actually just think that it shouldn't be the only fight that you call a gimmick fight, because these other difficult fights also have multiple of these annoying mechanics. It's either they're
Mm-hmm.
all gimmick fights, all 4 of them, or none of them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think singling her out as the one gimmick fight makes sense to me personally.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You want me to give my thoughts now? I'm sorry, I was just kind of letting you guys go.
No, you can go, right?
Yeah,
It's
no,
we
it's
get to
all
get
I
good.
mean,
into it.
I mean, really, it's like I know the third opinion here, and I'm gonna kind of take like the more passive route here, where I think that there are validity to both sides. The one thing I will say about the Bulma event, or like when you talk about Goku Frieza, the Goku Frieza gimmicks, if you will, are stuff that takes you out, takes your HP from 750,000 to 0, right? Where you can go into the Bulma fight with a team that's fully set up, and you do you make the plays right, but you just don't get the amount of rainbow orbs, or this unit doesn't do a super, and you just lose, right? It's not a you were defeated by the boss; it was just that the game ended because you didn't meet a requirement.
Yeah,
And so
totally.
I guess that is where things are a little bit different. But I think that you said it well, where technically, like every fight is a gimmick, right? A lock is a gimmick, an AOE is a gimmick. That's what makes these bosses unique. And it's just with the hot take, I think really kind of said is correct, right? Where Bulma is just kind of an extreme version of this, where rainbow orb changing and running characters that potentially might not be very good anymore. Like recently, for another thing that I had to do, I had to run the youth team in the Goku and Frieza, not the Goku Frieza fight, the Bulma fight, right? And so a character that ended up being really valuable, and the friend system be damned, right? Pat the Power Kid Goku was really good for this because of his rainbow orb changing ability, because of the key that he was able to give when Bulma was around, and it made that challenge a lot easier to do. But when you have to build a team and you're like, oh, what's a good option here? Pat the Power Kid Goku from 2022. I think that really speaks volumes to just how like strange that fight is compared to the rest of the game, where you're going to need an X amount of rainbow orbs, and then you're going to need an X amount of super attacks, and the game is actively trying to make sure that you can't super attack. And I just think it can be a lot more frustrating when I don't know what's more frustrating to you guys: a character not dodging, or not enough rainbow orbs are changed, or you just don't get that one super, right?
I would
Because
agree that it's more
let's
frustrating.
let's let's rip the band-aid off, right? Like the whole game's RNG, right? It's
Yeah.
all stat. Like, do you get the super? Do you get the dodge? Does the boss super here?
Yeah.
Sometimes the boss super is consistent, right? Goku, Frieza, they super slot one every time, basically, right? You think about a character like is it the Supreme Magnificent Battle, where it's the standby Super Saiyan Goku, where he's only going to attack once on that turn, and I think he may
Yeah.
heal, but it's always going to be a super,
Yeah.
Mhm.
right? Like it's one of those things, like where who's another good example? Like who's like a prominent AOE, right? Like Blue Gogeta. You have to probably run that fight 1,000 times, and Blue Gogeta Blue Zone is not going to easy or AOE, right? And so all of these gimmicks, they kind of just add up. And I think that with the Bulma one, it's just specifically people are not, and granted they shouldn't be, but people are not used to the you don't fulfill a specific condition during the fight, you lose, rather than it being, oh, the enemy took your HP down. And so I think that's where
Yeah.
like the big thing kind of comes from with calling it a gimmick fight, because it's just not the traditional way of losing, therefore it feels like a an extended gimmick.
Yeah,
But
I think that's
you
very,
said it
very
well,
true.
every fight is a gimmick. it's it's,
Yeah.
it's like a high damage super, guess what, it's a gimmick, right? Like a super that's going to take Beast Gohan for 500k of his HP, which is granted very rare, but that's a gimmick super technically. Like
Mm.
it's I don't know, it's tough, but
And
I
I
think
think
it's
that you could be on either side of the fence and be right. It doesn't matter.
you make a
yeah.
very fair point with that, because I would say that it's a different way of losing and how you lose compared to the
Hmm.
norm that we usually see. It's usually the boss kills you, and then you're
Right.
like, okay, he killed me, but then it's like Boma, oh, I couldn't get the orb, so then Boma just leaves. It's kind of like I think it's less of it being gimmicky, but then it's just more of an unsatisfying result that a lot of
Yeah.
people are
I
feeling,
definitely
Uh-huh.
agree
and
with
then
that.
they're saying, oh, it's gimmicky because of that.
Yep.
And
Mm.
I wouldn't say they're necessarily wrong, but I just would say it's a thing of, again, in my opinion, I personally view it as just like, oh, I lost because
Hmm.
I didn't get lucky,
Yeah.
or maybe this team just doesn't have the options for this event. But then I could apply certain teams like that to other events too. I think so.
Yeah.
At least that's how I view it. But
Hmm. At the end of the day, you're always going to hear ba when you lose, right? Like it's still the same idea. So
yeah,
it's
Yeah.
like, but like I said, I mean I you know what I'm trying to say. It's like, getting knocked out by the enemy and the enemy running away are just two different things. I
Yeah.
wasn't really seeing it on a level of satisfaction. I was just kind of seeing it on a level of just being different, right? Just not what you're used to.
Mhm.
But I think that you bring up a good point where it's like, oh, they just said, they just said forget about it and left. Like that's it.
Mhm.
Like that's like I didn't feel like, and especially like if someone, you're not reading what the stage does. Like imagine you're somebody that has no idea what this fight's doing. You go in and you just see that bar filling up, and it's like, okay, well maybe you're thinking it's like a fury meter or something, or like, oh, this event's gonna get super hard, and it's like you don't know what happened, and then Bulma just left and you lost. You're like, well, I still have full HP. Like she's not attacking, and you're like, you're not doing super attacks with full key. And also on top of that, with the Bulma fight, you go into that last phase where she is hitting like a modern boss. But the
Yeah.
counter to that is you could stun lock her. So it's like, it goes both ways. But it's like you have to have all these gimmick things, and then, oh, by
I
the way,
think
when you're done with all that, you have a real fight to do.
I think people also include calling it a gimmick fight with the fact that, like you said, when you do get through the first few like
Hmm.
gimmicks or like mechanics, you can then just like stun and seal and attack lower. So like none of the other
Hmm.
really hard bosses in the game you can do that. Which
Right.
again, goes back to what I was saying. It's not necessarily a bad thing to call it a gimmick
Hmm.
fight, but like it's just weird because it's like you jump through hoops in the first couple of phases, and then as long as you can avoid that very common slot one super that does massive damage if you get the STR Bulma, you can then pretty
Hmm.
much you'll get like a guaranteed W after that first
Hmm.
slot because like you said, actually it's a good point, right? Like there are some difficult events now that you would not be able to beat with certain teams like Path to Power Kid
Hmm.
Goku Youth Team. I did a run the other
Right.
day on one of the challenge run streams. I beat the Bulma event with the GT bosses team because that
Hmm.
team
The
has
debuffs.
all the
Yeah.
debuffs, and it does have some rainbow orb changes and characters that have additionals and stuff like that. But that team build wouldn't be any of the other like difficult end game fights. But it
there was
does
hope
manage to do
for
that
AGL
one.
Omega because of that.
Yeah.
Because like you remember, so like during the 9th anniversary, like especially on the JP side of things, like it was like, oh wow, look, AGL Omega can spam debuffs on Cell Max. So is GT Bosses back? Absolutely not. It's just this fight in specific. You could call it a gimmick fight because of the way that his attacks are changing with his HP and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, you get past the 4 turns or whatever, you could start lowering his defense. You can start debuffing him, and these things are going to add up. I had a thought, and then I just completely lost it. Oh, okay. So like, you know, we could kind of just, you know, I don't want to go on like a huge tangent here, but like, have we all played the Souls games here?
Yes.
No.
Oh,
So
yes.
okay. So people, I'll just give you an example, right? There's a fight in Elden Ring where you fight this big serpent, right? And it's like this whole crazy thing, but you get this badass spear that's like putting out like, you know, energy that's coming out of the spear, and you're stabbing it from range, and it's not meant to be that hard. It's supposed to be a spectacle, and they call that a gimmick fight in these Souls games,
Yes.
right? It's not a traditional hard boss
Yeah.
where, you know, you're required to learn these advanced hand-eye coordinations and timings and boss patterns, and you still have to a degree in this fight, but they call it a gimmick fight because they're giving you this weapon, right? Where it's like it's going to be doing an extreme amount of damage to the boss and gives you range that you're typically not allowed to have with a melee weapon sort of idea, and that's where it kind of comes down to. So like by calling it a gimmick fight, it's sort of like dumbs it down on a skill level to a degree, right? You're like, oh, okay, this boss is really cool, but it's a gimmick fight. It's not supposed to be like this, you know, test of like willpower and you know, persistence like most Souls bosses are.
Yeah.
Right. So I think when people want to say like after they beat the Bulma fight it was hard, but then you know you're gonna have some cat on Twitter or like your friends say, but okay, it's a gimmick fight. Who cares? So I think that's kind of where that comes from.
I think one thing is that people like not using it, or like a lot of people that I see, but some people use the term gimmick fight to paint it as, oh, this fight is a gimmick fight, doesn't matter. It's like,
Right.
that's another thing. I think that's
You can't-
separate from this conversation.
Yeah, that's why I
Like it
wanted.
is,
That's
yeah,
why I wanted to
for
be clear that
showcases,
like
right?
I wasn't saying it as a negative, and I'm not saying that
Yeah.
like because it's a gimmick fight, it doesn't matter. Like, I do think it's weird to rate teams against because of that, right? Because you have to bring like rainbow orb changes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's
You
I just
can't
feel like
say
other fights
sorry.
will eventually include those things,
Mhm.
and we've seen that already. So,
Yep.
like the battle bombs thing, that's gonna be included in fights in the future for sure.
Yeah.
Then they usually like they've been expanding on these mechanics. So, yeah. I think this is a good discussion. I don't know if there's anything else y'all wanted
Yeah.
to point out specifically.
I think it's I think when people like you just to kind of like put the bow on it, right? It's like fine to call it like a regular fight, but I think that is not a fight that we are going to be using as like the bar for like is this character good or not, right? It's like because if this character doesn't have rainbow orb changers on their team, but they're phenomenal, that's not really they like that the fault of the unit, right?
Yeah.
Or they
Yeah.
don't get like a built-in additional super, but they literally can't like take any damage. It's like that character's still a tank, but the Bulma fight should not be the bar, right? Because when we think about some of the hardest fights in the past, right? Like what was the bar for a long time? It was Fusion Zamasu for the red zone,
Yeah.
especially for global players, right?
Because of the
it was like, is this
AoEs.
character good in this opening rotation simulator, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, because you can't use it to necessarily rate like an individual unit. Because if we just look at like Buhan, for example, he doesn't rainbow orb change or do additional supers, so he's
Right.
he's a terrible unit for the Bulma fight. Even though you can
But- and
obviously
that does-
make
yeah.
a good team build with him as the leader, he himself in a vacuum, he's a terrible unit for that fight because he doesn't have anything that helps you beat the first two phases.
And that's not a negative to him. Like, that's the
Exactly,
thing, right?
exactly. It's just the sake of the event itself. And the thing is, in other events, we talked about like other events have these mechanics, right? Because that's part of the take itself, right? That other fights have these mechanics. Well, other fights have mechanics that will lower your team's key, but you don't lose if you don't get a certain number of super attacks in that turn, right? So that's where like the big difference comes in, I think. But yeah, it's interesting discussion. Like I say, it's not necessarily calling it a gimmick fight. I would say is not necessarily trying to dismiss it or like use it as a negative thing. I just think compared to the way the other fights work, and I think Vilify expanded on that a fair bit, especially around the losing condition. It's just based on the way other fights work. It is just very, very different, which I think a lot of people find frustrating, I guess. But that doesn't
People don't
necessarily
like
make it
change.
bad. Yeah.
You know? It's
I
I think it's a fun discussion to be had though when the take isn't just like this character is in top 10. Everybody's like, yeah, probably not. But it's like
Yeah.
Here it's like you can really have multiple perspectives, right? Like, especially like once like now that it kind of sucks that Goku and Frieza isn't going to be like what it was when it comes out on Global, because I feel like that could have been a fun discussion as well. But like Global having like access to the movie bosses team and all these other things, it's just way different than what it was when it came out. But
Yeah.
that cycle is over in a month and a half here, so
Yep.
hopefully.
Well, hopefully so. We'll see what the 10th anniversary stuff is like. So that's it for the trash takes. I mean, based on what I see in the chat, it is a total for L take. No, yeah,
Okay,
L take is 66%, W take is 33%.
that's better.
Yeah, it's about
Again, you
two-thirds,
can
yeah.
add up to 100% because of variable, whatever. But
Mhm.
I think that's fair, right? It really
Mhm.
depends on how you view it. I think would say again, if it's a thing of you view all the fights as gimmick fights, that's fine. I just don't agree. I think it's all or none, in my opinion. But it depends on how you personally feel. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
it's just a gotcha game. Nothing really too serious to be taken from it.